Hi, welcome to the Fetch portion of our ES6 features section of the React Stack Bootcamp training. Fetch. Fetch provides an API, the Fetch API provides a JavaScript interface for accessing and manipulating parts of the HTTP pipeline, such as requests and responses. It also provides a global fetch method, which provides an easy, logical way to fetch resources asynchronously across the network. So fetch, let me just sum that up. Fetch is basically a network library. We're going to be able to make requests and have data returned to us. So fetch returns a promise. That's why this section comes after promises. So we've learned how to write promises and how to interact with them. Fetch returns a promise, and we're going to be able to interact with the values that returns. The results or errors from that network request, from the fetch request, are going to be accessed using then and catch methods. So the fetch object, or the fetch method itself, accepts a URL, but in addition to a URL, we can also pass a parameter object. That's kind of a config object you can use to send headers, CORS information, send like the method that we want to send, right? Get, post, put. So these methods can all be passed into the fetch call to allow real flexibility in how we want to make that request. So this is what a call could look like. We have a fetch. The fetch method is invoked, and it's passed the URL of the resource we want to access, and optionally an object which contains the options. All right, so like I mentioned, fetch returns a promise, and we're going to interact with that data in the same way we would interact with a promise, by using a then and catch methods. So in addition to those, the response body, right? Because then is going to give us, we're going to get a response body back. In addition to the response body itself, the response object contains a lot of helper functions and methods. So one particular one would be .json. That would convert a response body to JSON, or .ok, which would check the status code. So if something was within a 200 range, then it's okay. So I think it's valuable to take just a quick look at what that fetch API actually is for the response body. So I'm going to go ahead and look up the MDN fetch response. So here's a list of some of those properties. Right, so there's we can inspect headers. Okay, this is the one we mentioned earlier. It's a Boolean whether the response was successful, if it's within the 200 range. Here's a property to indicate whether the request was transparently redirected. The status code itself, if you want to actually check the status code directly, not just relying on whether it's okay or not. And then the text of the status code, the type of the response, the URL of the response. Here's some of the methods now we can use on that object. So a common one we'll use is JSON, right? So it's going to take a response stream and read it to completion. It returns a promise that resolves with the result of parsing the body text as JSON. So when we get our response back, if you think about the network pipeline, all right, we'll make a response, and then we're going to get something back. And the very first thing we get back is our kind of like our head request, right? So it's going to tell us here's the status, and then after that, we'd continue to get the body of the response. So this .json, we're going to be able to call this as soon as we get a response back, but the response may not have been fully delivered to us, right? It's data that's streaming in. So it's going to read that data, that response stream, and it's going to read it to completion. And when that's finished, .json is going to return to us a promise, right, that will resolve when that is finished. So we can also, there's .text, .form data, .blob, .array buffer, different methods that we can use that are useful in working with in the network pipeline. So here's an example of what this might look like. We have a fetch call to myservice.com/JSON, and we're passing it an object. So the next line is a then. method. We're saying get the response, right? That's our parameter incoming, and check if the response is okay. There's the ternary expression here. So if the response is okay, return response.json. If it's not okay, right, so this falls outside of the 200 range, then return promise.reject of the response. So we're going to call the static reject method on a promise. So assuming it's okay, it's going to read that stream to completion, convert it to JSON, and then when that's finished, then our then here will be called. At that point, we can do something. We can manipulate the JSON. We can trim it down. We can save it in part of our application. We can display it to the screen, whatever we need to do with that. And if there's an error here, catch, right, do something with that error. So here's a question to consider. If we have a catch already, why do we need to check to see if the status is an OK status code? I'll just throw that out there. One reason is that this status code, right? So if a status code returns 500, that's still a valid network request, right? The request itself did not fail. The fetch call did not fail. It just happens to be that the data that the server returned, we're interpreting it as being, the request, the server returned an invalid response, right? A 500 error, or there's a server error or something like that, right? Say for a 404, a 404, although that's not what we want, is still a valid network request. So when we check if a response is okay, we're checking if the status code is what we expect it to be in order to proceed, and then any actual network failures that would happen would be caught here in a catch, right? Or other actual errors that occur. So trimming a response, we've used a couple techniques before to take in large objects and then pluck out pieces of that. We used the parameter object destructuring and then implicitly returning of an object. So we're going to use that technique here to illustrate how we can trim responses down. So we're going to make a request to this URL, receive data. If that data is valid, interpret it as JSON or convert it to JSON. And then we're going to destructure out certain properties and then pass on to the next then only those same properties. So this would be a useful pattern if, for example, you were hitting an API and it returned to you a very large object that had more data than you want or need, right? If you're hitting an API about a user and it's returning to you all this biographical information and you only need their name and maybe their like access role level, it may be useful to trim that response down to just pluck out the few pieces of that object and then pass that on to the next then, just for convenience in working with the object. All right, so we're going to make a fetch call. Here's our activity. Make a fetch call that gets information about a book from the Google Book API, then log out some information from the API response. So in the console, in the JavaScript tab, we have an ISBN and a service URL that we're using a template literal just to put those together. So the activity is make a fetch call to this URL, and that's going to return JSON about a book. And so using then or catch, read that JSON and pluck some interesting pieces out and display it to the screen. So you can go ahead and pause the video now and work on this activity. Okay, we're back from the activity. Hopefully you've got a great working version, and we'll write one now just so you can see an example. So we'll make a fetch call. And just one thing to note here in our CodePen environment, we've got run turned off. Auto run is turned off. And so if you'd like to run this, go ahead and click the run button. The reason it's turned off is so we don't have a network request being made every keystroke, right? That would probably quickly we'd be throttled or cut off from this this free service. All right, so we're going to make a fetch call, and we're going to make a fetch call to that service URL. And when it returns, we're going to receive a response. And the first thing we want to do with that response is check if it's a valid response. So response.ok. And if it is valid, we're going to return that response interpreted as JSON. And if it's not, we will return a rejected promise using the static reject method on the promise object. So at this point, in this next then, we now should have JSON data that's come back from this service. And so I think it's really useful to just take a look. I'm going to open up this URL either in your browser tab or in Postman or some other way that allows us to look at the JSON data before we start manipulating it. So this is a pretty big response just for a single ISBN, but we've got it looks like a total count of items. So there's 2 items that were returned. Here's an array of those items. So let's take a look at the first item. We have an ID. We have like a permalink to that specific book. And then we have a sub-object called volume info. And volume info has given us some information about the book itself, the title, the authors, when it was published, a description. So I think we should pull some information out of volume info. So let's go ahead and trim this response down. So we're going to say response, and what we're going to return from that is response. And let's look at items. And we'll just work with the first item now. .volume info. So we've now scoped this response just to this block. Now let's take this block and let's pluck some properties out of it and return them as an object. So I think we should keep the title, the description, and the authors. Okay, and then let's log that data. And don't forget to run it. All right, so we didn't work as we expected. Let's go ahead and see if what we've probably got here. Title's not defined. So within volume info. Oh, okay. Yep. So I'm just pulling these properties out, and I forgot to prefix them right with the name of the object they're on. Response.title, response.description, and response.authors. Let's go ahead and run this again. There we go. So we're making a fetch request to the service, checking if it's okay. If it is okay, parsing it as JSON. And then we're going to scope down that response to a specific object within that response, that big JSON tree. and then further from that response, further scope it down to just these properties, and then we're going to log that out. Let's go ahead and look at the next activity, activity plus. So the activity plus is to wrap the fetch call in a function which accepts search parameters. So now we have a callable function, basically a search function, that we can call that same service over and over again, passing it different data to call. So something useful to know, right? So we've got this string for this ISBN colon and the ISBN there. This could be title or description, or you could leave this blank and you could just say query equals and have free form text here that the user could pass in. So go ahead and pause the video now and work on the activity plus. Okay, we're back from doing that second activity. I'll go ahead and demonstrate how this could be done. So we're going to wrap our fetch call in a function which will accept data. So this is a search function. Say const search, and it's going to take a query, and what that query is going to return is the then. So we now have some we now have a decision to make, I think, about how we want to be interacting with this search function. Should the search function itself be responsible for doing this work, or should search just return all the data and then we interact with it later, right, after it's called? And I think it's probably a better idea to interact with it later so that we're not baking into our search function all of this like business logic, right, of manipulating the data itself. So let's say search is just going to return this. It'll just return the JSON. All right, so now we'll interact with search, and we don't want to fetch the service. We'll take this string here, and rather than doing the ISBN, we'll just have this be free-form text here. The user can pass in. So we'll do q equals the query, like that. So this is just, let's take a step back. This is a function here which accepts a query and returns a fetch call. Well, it returns either JSON or a rejected promise from the fetch call. So now we'll interact with it here. We'll say search, and we'll search for, we'll just search for the same book, Cat in the Hat. And let's say in this case, we only want the title. So we'll just return the title. Let's go ahead and run that. There we go. We can now search for something else. There you go. So this is just to reiterate, this is a demonstration now of taking a fetch call and making that fetch call dynamic by wrapping it in a function and using that function now to be configurable. I just want to point out, I think it might be nice to point out that this is a pattern now we've seen several times, right? We're learning a basic concept and then taking that basic concept and wrapping it in functions. And those functions are now configurable. And in essence, we're writing code that writes code for us, right? We've written a search function, and what that search function does is now returning the results of these other functions. So we can use these over and over, right? We're writing configurable code using this functional paradigm. Fetch is useful, it's great. We're going to learn a bit more about fetch in our React section, and when we bring it all together, we'll use fetch quite a bit in our final project. But that's it for this CodePen. We've done the activity and the activity plus. The next section is on imports and exports, and go ahead and watch that at your convenience.